We often analyze human behavior and personality to understand why individuals rise or fall. Today, we take that lens further, seeing the world as a vast nervous system, where nations also possess behavior, character, and survival instincts of their own. And when we apply this psychological perspective to the future, 2035 reveals an uncomfortable truth. The next global powers won't emerge from familiar places. Not from the traditional centers of power, but from nations once dismissed as peripheral. As all superpowers slow down and the global order begins to fracture, it is the overlooked countries of today that will shape tomorrow. And if you believe you already know who will lead the world, this video will force you to rethink everything. The world is entering a transition that everyone senses, yet very few truly understand. Power is no longer determined by the size of an economy today, but by a nation's ability to adapt to the forces reshaping tomorrow. Artificial intelligence is rewriting the structure of work. Clean energy is redefining what strategic resource even means. Young populations are becoming more valuable than oil, and global supply chains are quietly abandoning old centers in search of stability. Amid this turbulence, something subtle is happening. The nations unburdened by outdated systems are rising faster than anyone predicted. 2035 isn't the birth of new powers out of nowhere. It's the moment when long-hidden shifts finally break the surface. Among all emerging economies, only Indonesia possesses the one asset the world of 2035 cannot function without: control over the core material of the new energy age. Not oil, nickel, the metal that defines the future of electric batteries, energy storage, and mobile technology. Indonesia doesn't just hold the largest nickel reserves on Earth, it is doing something few nations have the leverage or the discipline to do, shutting down raw exports and forcing the entire chain smelting, refining, and manufacturing to take place inside its borders. This means the wealthiest corporations in the world have no choice but to invest, transfer technology, and build real industrial capacity directly in Indonesia. And when clean energy becomes as fundamental to global power as oil was in the 20th century, the country that controls its raw materials gains a form of influence even OPEC never achieved. Indonesia is also entering the demographic phase every great power experiences before its rise: a long demographic dividend, a rapidly expanding middle class, and a government stable enough to operate on decades-long strategy instead of election cycles. The difference is that Indonesia doesn't need to chase foreign investment, the world must come to them, because no nation can build the future of energy without passing through Indonesian supply chains. This creates a new kind of silent dominance. Indonesia doesn't need to compete, it simply needs to exist while the world grows more dependent on it every year. By 2035, when electric mobility is no longer optional and clean energy becomes the skeleton of global infrastructure, Indonesia will no longer be just a Southeast Asian country. It will be the backbone of the world's most important industrial system, the kind of actor that, if removed, would collapse everything built on top of it. And that is what a 21st century power truly looks like: quiet, immovable, and impossible to replace. Brazil's rise is not the rise of factories or microchips. It is the rise of something older and far more difficult to challenge: the power of owning what the world cannot reproduce: land, water, climate, and strategic resources. In an era where clean energy becomes the skeleton of the global economy, Brazil quietly occupies a position no one expected: a state capable of feeding the world and powering it at the same time. While climate change cripples food production across continents, Brazil expands its output with industrial-scale precision. It dominates global supply chains of soy, beef, sugar, and corn, not by accident, but through decades of engineering agriculture into a weapon of influence. And every time the world shakes, Brazil's leverage grows. But agriculture is only one half of the equation. The other is energy. Brazil already runs one of the largest and most stable renewable grids on Earth. hydropower, wind, and solar feeding industries that other nations can only dream of hosting. As the world transitions into electric mobility, green manufacturing, and energy-intensive AI systems, Brazil holds the rarest advantage of all: abundant, cheap, stable, renewable energy at national scale. By 2035, Brazil won't need to out-innovate the US or outspend the Middle East. It merely needs to maintain the one dependency the world cannot escape: food, minerals, and clean energy. When a nation controls the resources the world needs to survive, it doesn't compete for power, it becomes power. Most of the world still sees Saudi Arabia as a wealthy oil state trying to diversify, but that view completely misses the deeper truth. Saudi is not simply changing its economy, it is redefining the role of the Middle East in the global order. And the most striking part is that this transformation is not being carried out through conflict, but through a far more sophisticated weapon: the reconstruction of the future. Saudi understands a truth few governments have the courage to face. Oil won't disappear, but the power that comes from oil is evaporating. So instead of waiting for decline, Saudi is building the next version of global energy. While other nations debate what AI might become, Saudi is already pouring billions into supercomputers, data centers, hydrogen technology, and mega projects that quietly ask the world, why is an oil state the most prepared for the post-oil era? The answer is simple. In the 20th century, power belonged to those who controlled oil. In the 21st, power belongs to those who control clean energy, data, and capital, and Saudi is positioning itself at the intersection of all three before anyone else even arrives. Neom is not a futuristic city, it is a declaration that Saudi doesn't want to sell resources, it wants to sell the future. Riyadh doesn't aspire to become another Dubai, it aims to become the mandatory stop for every industry that will define the next era: green hydrogen, AI infrastructure, desert tech, ultra-luxury tourism, and the capital flows that fuel global expansion. By 2035, the real question will not be what happens to Saudi when oil declines. It will be what happens to the world when Saudi's new identity begins to shape global strategy. A nation that owns the power of the last century and is buying the power of the next fits the exact profile of a superpower in the making. On the world's power map, some nations don't need massive GDP or overwhelming population, they simply need to stand in the right place. And no country holds a sharper strategic position than Turkey, the gatekeeper between Europe, the Middle East, and the Black Sea. Yet geography is only the surface. What truly elevates Turkey is its ability to convert that geography into a flexible, pragmatic mechanism of power, one that forces NATO, Russia, and the entire Middle East to factor Ankara into every move they make. In the past decade, no nation has pivoted faster or more effectively. Member of NATO, buyer of Russians 400 seconds, supplier of drones to Ukraine, controller of the Bosphorus Strait that both Russia and the West depend on. Turkey operates in the grey zones of geopolitics, and it is in those grey zones that it generates a type of influence great powers despise, yet cannot escape: unpredictable but indispensable. As Europe weakens under the weight of aging demographics and costly energy, Turkey is expanding its defense industry, becoming one of the world's leading suppliers of UAVs, systems that redefine how modern wars are fought. This is not merely producing weapons, it is manufacturing leverage. Every nation that flies a Bayraktar is a nation influenced by Ankara. Turkey does not need to be a global superpower. It only needs to control the choke points: Europe's energy routes, the Black Sea's security balance, and the stability of the Middle East. By 2035, economic recovery is just one chapter. The real story is this: once Turkey transforms geography into structural influence, every major power will be forced to account for Ankara in their strategic calculus. And in a multipolar world, the nation that others must consider is already powerful. For decades, the world looked at Nigeria through a lens of chaos and corruption, and in doing so, it missed the explosive truth. Nigeria is one of the rare nations holding the three ingredients every major power in history has needed, but almost never at the same time: a massive young population, continental-scale energy resources, and one of the fastest urbanization rates on Earth. These forces don't create stability at first, they create raw energy, the kind that, if channeled correctly, can bend the future. By 2035, Nigeria will enter a demographic window most advanced economies will never see again. A labor force expanding faster than global demand in a world starved of young workers. As the West ages, Asia slows, and labor shortages become structural, Nigeria will supply the one resource more valuable than oil: people. But population isn't what makes Nigeria dangerous. Influence is. With oil, natural gas, rare minerals, and near limitless solar potential, Nigeria sits on the energy foundation of the next century. While others struggle to build green capacity, Nigeria possesses what they need: land, sunlight, reserves, and time. Add to this its position as the gateway between West Africa and the rest of the continent, and Nigeria becomes the place every major power, America, China, the Gulf, must pass through to access Africa's future markets. What the world miscalculates is not Nigeria's risk, but its volatility. Young, chaotic, resource-rich nations don't grow linearly. When order begins to take shape, they explode. This is why Nigeria is the most dangerous unknown in global economics. No one knows whether it will stumble for another decade or emerge as Africa's financial, technological, energy core. But if the second scenario unfolds, it will shift the balance of an entire continent and perhaps reshape global power itself. By 2035, Nigeria may still be imperfect, even contradictory, but history shows that great powers are not always born from stability. Sometimes they rise from turbulence and from places the world never bothered to watch. Among the rising powers of 2035, Mexico is the strangest case. A country that isn't trying to become a global power, yet is being pushed into that position by forces it did not initiate. As the world withdraws from dependence on China and global supply chains seek new safe ground, Mexico suddenly becomes the one answer corporations in the US, Europe, and even East Asia cannot ignore. Mexico's advantage is not demographic or mineral, it is the rare combination of location and cost. A 3,000-kilometer border with the United States, the world's largest consumer market, makes Mexico the natural factory of North America. But the true shift comes from nearshoring, companies abandoning China not for home turf but for Mexico, where labor is affordable, logistics are short, and USMCA grants access to the American market without political friction. When production leaves Asia, Mexico doesn't have to compete, it simply has to receive. EV components, medical devices, aerospace parts, semiconductors, entire industries are planting themselves along the northern border faster than Mexico can even record them. Corporations are now saying something unthinkable a few years ago. Mexico is becoming America's strategic manufacturing base, a role that China owned for nearly 2 decades. But Mexico's rise is not just economic, it is structural leverage. If the US wants stable supply chains, it cannot afford instability in Mexico. And if global companies want to de-risk from China, they cannot bypass Mexico. This cannot bypass dynamic is the essence of modern power. By 2035, Mexico may not be a superpower in the conventional sense, but it will be a nation the world's largest economies depend on to keep their industries running. And in an era where chips, clean energy, and EVs require shorter, tighter, more secure supply chains, Mexico will sit at the center of a new manufacturing order where the holder of the production line doesn't chase power, power finds them. Vietnam's rise is not driven by demographics, vast resources, or a massive domestic market. Its strength comes from something far rarer: the ability to become relevant at exactly the moment the world needs a new center of gravity. As global supply chains fracture and reorganize, Vietnam sits at the intersection of cost efficiency, political stability, and international accessibility, an almost perfect configuration for the economy of the future. Vietnam's ascent is systemic rather than explosive. One industry at a time, electronics, medical devices, semiconductors, renewable components, advanced logistics, has shifted into the country with a kind of disciplined logic. This is one of the few places where investors can find the stability they require, the cost they expect, and the adaptability they cannot obtain in slowing major economies. Its young, technically skilled workforce delivers what modern supply chains need most: reliable productivity. But Vietnam's deeper power lies in geopolitics. Positioned between the two giants of Asia, the US and China, Vietnam maintains a rare strategic balance: open enough for Western investment, pragmatic enough to sustain trade with China, and independent enough to avoid being pulled into anyone's orbit. This multi-vector strategy makes Vietnam one of the most valuable neutral hubs in Asia, a place every power wants influence in, yet none can dominate. By 2035, Vietnam's significance will not simply come from manufacturing output, but from its role as an irreplaceable node in high-tech supply chains, especially as the world moves toward clean energy, electric mobility, and semiconductors. A nation does not need to lead the frontier of innovation to shape the future. Sometimes, it only needs to stand in the one spot that all innovation must pass through. Vietnam is becoming that spot. In a new multipolar era, where stability is scarce and trust is strategic currency, Vietnam's quiet rise may prove more powerful than loud ambition. Its stability is its strategy, its adaptability is its power. When people talk about the future, they ask which nations will rise. But the more important and far more dangerous question is, which nations are quietly falling? Because new powers do not emerge in a vacuum. They rise through the cracks left behind by old ones collapsing. And in the 21st century, decline rarely comes from war. It comes from demographics, energy, and structural exhaustion. Japan is the clearest example. A technological giant suffocated not by competition, but by time. An aging population erodes productivity, innovation, and growth. No economy can outrun demographics. Germany, once the industrial backbone of Europe, faces a reality reshaping its entire identity. Without cheap energy, heavy manufacturing cannot survive. As its auto industry is challenged by China's EV dominance, Germany's influence fades with it. The United Kingdom pays the quiet price of Brexit, shrinking finance, vanishing investment, and a global role narrower than at any point in modern history. A former empire reduced not by force, but by fragmentation. Russia's decline is self-inflicted, an economy trapped in resources, isolated from technology, and hollowed out by demographic collapse. Military power can mask weakness, but it cannot reverse it. South Korea faces a more silent enemy, the lowest birth rate on earth. A world-class tech economy cannot thrive without workers or consumers. Decline, in this case, is arithmetic. Italy, burdened by debt and stagnation, does not collapse. It simply stops moving, and in a fast world, stillness is another form of downfall. These nations will not disappear. But as the future is built by youth, energy, and adaptability, they will stand at the sidelines of a race they once led. And the most unsettling part is this: they are not losing to stronger opponents. They are losing to their own structure, quietly, inevitably. By 2035, the world may no longer be led by the loudest nations, the richest economies, or the most heavily armed states. Power in the new era is not a contest of size, but a continuous test of adaptation. The countries we've explored are not the strongest of today. They are the ones most aligned with the architecture of tomorrow, young, flexible, resource-rich, or positioned at points the world must inevitably pass through. That said, every projection of the future is only a snapshot in time. The world never stands still, power is never fixed, and no one can predict with certainty what the next decade will bring. The nations discussed here are not guaranteed outcomes, but examples of structures that currently demonstrate the strongest capacity to adapt to a shifting global order. This leads to a truth many find uncomfortable. In times of transformation, it is not the strongest who prevail, but the most suited to the world that is emerging. Nations that invest in people, technology, new energy, and strategic geography may rise without announcement. Those trapped in outdated systems may decline without collapse. Power will no longer be built by ambition alone but by alignment, and alignment cannot be faked. 2035 may not mark the age of singular superpowers, but the rise of fragmented centers of influence, where any nation, large or small, can become a critical node in the global system. The unsettling reality is that most of us are still viewing the world through the map of the past, while a new order is quietly forming beneath our feet. The future may arrive very differently from what we imagine today, and that is precisely why the most valuable outcome is not a final answer, but an open conversation. Which countries do you believe are rising? Do you agree or disagree with the analysis in this video? Share your perspective, because the future is not shaped by silent predictions, but by ideas willing to be questioned.